One theory that can be used to explain Rachel's performance is drive theory. This is another example of one of the arousal theories. This theory was proposed by Hull 1943 and Spence 1966, which was one of the earliest and simplistic ways of explaining arousal. Hull 1951 proposed that there is a directly proportional relationship between arousal and performance, because as the levels of arousal increase, this results in increased performance. But this is also affected by your habitual response, as if this is intensified, it is more likely to occur with higher levels of arousal. If it is a correct performance, that is enhanced, and if it is an incorrect performance, it is hindered. This is because drive energises behaviour, and therefore having more drive will result in higher performance. This theory demonstrates there is a clear relationship between these variables, but it is important to take into account that the quality of performance is determined by how well the individual can replicate the skill, through how well it's been learned, and the dominant response is more likely to be produced if the individual is more aroused. It shows that Rachel, unlike Nick and Sarah, as her levels of arousal increase, so does her performance, and this pressure which she thrives upon brings about the dominant response, which allows her to perform her role as centre and produce more accurate passes and interceptions to win the ball. Having high levels of arousal doesn't actually hinder her performance at all. Rachel can very much cope with the high arousal levels and pressure, and she thrives off of it. So it actually sort of helps her performance compared to Nick and Sarah, which actually hinders their performance. There are positive implications to this theory in that it provides a true representation for experienced performers, as they thrive, like Rachel, on high levels of arousal to perform, because they know how to execute their skills under pressure due to experience, so they like the crowd to provide some motivation for them in a way to psych them up. This is similar for the well-learned skills because it becomes a dominant response, so Rachel may be more experienced than Sarah, and therefore the skills come more naturally to her, so she can take the pressure because she has been in the same position many times before. But it's important to consider that Sarah has a much more technical role than Rachel, and this takes time and practice to master before it becomes a dominant response, so it's simple for gross motor skills, but not for the fine motor skills. However, there are criticisms with this theory, because not all the time arousal leads to better performance. As research has demonstrated, it can have the opposite effect. If you have too much arousal, it can actually hinder your performance. If the habitual response is incorrect because you are a beginner player and haven't mastered the skill accurately, you are more likely to be aroused in a negative way, and therefore you will not perform well. It has been shown that beginners require lower levels of arousal so they can concentrate and not feel pressure from spectators or other competitors to play their best. However, more elite or experienced athletes can cope with higher arousal levels because they have mastered the skills, so they are more confident in themselves and therefore perform better. Therefore, this theory isn't the best for cognitive learners, but could be more acceptable for elite performers. But there are still some conflicting views on this, as we have seen many experienced performers fail in their sports at major competitions. Due to the high arousal levels, can cause them to become too ready, and therefore they overperform and then fail, and the whole performance ends up failing. It fails to explain why professionals experience a drop in performance when they are experiencing high arousal and this rapid decline in performance. We have previously mentioned briefly Izoff's model, but we're just going to look in a bit more detail. So Izoff stands for Individualized Zones of Optimal Functioning, and it was proposed by Hannon in 1986. This basically proposes the idea that there is an optimal level of state anxiety, and it doesn't always occur at a midpoint on a continuum. And it doesn't happen in a single point, but more of a bandwidth. As we can see that different performers actually perform differently. So we can see athlete A is in their zone, their best performance, at an anxiety level of around 40. But then anything beyond that, they're out of their zone. So this athlete is working better at a lower optimum state. Whereas athlete B is out of zone from until 40, in the zone best performance from 40 to 50, and then out of zone again. They have more of a moderate Izoff, so they're able to cope with a moderate level of anxiety. If their performance. And athlete C we can see is out of zone completely from 30 to 50, but in their best zone between 50 and 60 are high anxiety levels. So we could determine from this that athlete A could be someone who, like an archer, someone who's taking part in a fine mode skill, needs to be low aroused, have low anxiety in order to effectively hit the target and perform well. We could say athlete B is more of a moderate performer, so we could relate to someone like Rachel, who is in the zone best performance when they have moderate levels of anxiety, which allows them to thrive off the pressure and perform well, to have a little bit of pressure but not too much. And we could say athlete C who has high levels of arousal, is more of an experienced athlete, maybe a sprinter or a long jumper. So we could say someone like Usain Bolt, who thrives best performance in when there's high anxiety. They thrive off the pressure. We could also say Rachel relates to this athlete C as well, because she has high levels of anxiety. And we would say athlete A would be more of Nick and Sarah. They are best in their zone when there's low levels of anxiety, and when this exceeds their optimal level, they become out of their zone. It's important to note that athletes have individual differences and preferences for the level of anxiety that is optimal. And this depends on how, if they feel in full control. If they feel like they have control of their surroundings, they may benefit from higher levels of anxiety. If they don't, they may prefer lower levels of anxiety, depending on how well they can handle pressure. In terms of the execution of the skills, as we've said, complex or simple skills will determine whether the anxiety will be higher or lower, depending on how the athlete feels they can accurately execute them. Their attention and concentration focus. They can't accurately sort of widen or narrow their attention span. They may require lower levels of anxiety and arousal. And if they feel completely confident, we would see them to have more, maybe less anxiety, but they will be able to cope at the high anxiety levels. Yeah, and Hannin proposed that there are individual differences in the way that people actually respond to anxiety. He found that elite athletes succeeded when the anxiety was low, but it was different for other athletes who still achieved success when the anxiety was high. This basically concluded that it's different for every athlete. There are different optimal levels of anxiety and which produces the best performance. So as we've seen, Rachel and Sarah and Nick all have different levels of optimum anxiety, which allows them to perform at their best and which can affect their performance. The optimal level of anxiety is not a threshold, as the inverted U or catastrophe theory mentions, but it's a bandwidth, as we've said, not one single continuum. It's not to do with being psyched up or exceeding a threshold of arousal. And the athlete can either be within or outside the zone, to do with their individual preference. So if they're slightly outside their zone, they may still be able to perform at their best, maybe a bit below, but when it exceeds a certain point, this then has this deterioration in their performance. And as we've mentioned, it's to do with introverts and extroverts and how personality, task type, stage of learning and experience can all benefit from having lower levels of arousal and higher levels of arousal. So overall, Izoff's model and the theory is generally supported. Lots of research has been conducted and it provides lots of evidence that this is a really useful method that athletes can use. And it's been shown to be a better predictor than the inverted U theory. It seems to offer more of an explanation as to how the athletes can actually still function if they're out of their zone or out of their optimal level, but it's to beyond a certain point. So it says that there's not just one optimal level. The inverted U theory states that we have to have moderate levels to be working at our maximal optimal point, but this model takes into account that there are different sort of optimal points for different performers. As we can see with Rachel and Sarah, they both have different individual differences in the sort of arousal levels that they prefer to perform at. However, Izov's theory, there is no explanation of how this model actually develops. So we don't know how, in terms of sport, that this can actually sort of work, and how that it can actually affect the athletes, because it's not necessarily true that the best performers are more likely to be in their optimal zone. There can be times in certain competitions or whatever where the performers are, they may be experienced, but they may become over aroused and have more anxiety than usual. Potentially, if it's, for example, their last Olympics, they may feel more pressure than any other Olympic competition that they've been in. It's not necessarily true that best performances are more likely to be in their optimal zone. You can still perform well if you're out of your zone to a certain extent, but still best performances don't always occur in the optimal zone, and it actually depends on the other factors that can actually influence this as well. As we said, situational and personal factors, so the task type or the athletic experiences, it cannot be used to predict optimal zone. It's very much to do with the individual and sort of their state of mind and the physiological and psychological ways that they perceive the situation and how they think. So that this is some major limitations of this model, of Hanin's model. And here's my reference list of where I got my information from. Thank you for listening.